Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Kate Fitzgerald, and I am the Distance Learning Specialist here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. But before we get started, I want to do a quick review of technology. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and you should be seeing a "Don't go away." The webinar will begin shortly. And now you should see something that says Participation Technology Review. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little box that has a Q in it, and that says Q&A. And if you have any questions about technology or any questions for myself or Kirby, if you'll go ahead and type those questions into the Q&A box, we will get to those at the end of this presentation in our Q&A section. So now you should be seeing a screen with the cover of the book. And if you go to our museum website store, the link below, the link was also in your teacher guide that was sent out. And we will resend that teacher guide to everyone after the program is over in case you need it again. But you will receive a 20% discount from the museum store if you order code word courage using the code word webinar. All right. So if you haven't already purchased the book, this would be a great time to do it. And so without further ado, today's presentation is on code word courage, and we are joined by Kirby Larson. She is a Newberry Award winner, and she's here to talk about her research and why she chose to write code word courage. So she's going to start, and then I'm going to do a little bit about the themes in the book after Kirby gives her portion, and then we'll end our session with a Q&A where we can take questions. So without further ado.
You ready for me to take it away? All right.
Yes. So while Kirby talks, I'm going to mute myself and take away my video, but I will come right back on as soon as Kirby is done.
And we're going to go to, oops. Okay, so do you just see, no, there we go. Got it. All right. I'm excited to talk to you all about this book, which is the fourth and final book in the series that we call The Dogs of World War II. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I came to be a writer and a little bit about my writing process as well. So like many of you, I had this burning question as a kid, like, what shall I be when I grow up? For a long time, I wanted to be a circus performer doing the flying trapeze. And then after I read the Encyclopedia Brown books, I decided I definitely wanted to be a detective, but my mom said that would be too dangerous. A lot of girls in my generation were encouraged to be nurses, but I get queasy at the sight of blood, so that did not seem like a good solution. And finally, when I realized how much I loved reading, I thought, hey, maybe I could be a writer of children's books. And so I started writing stories and sending them out, and I would send them to publishers in New York City because that's where most of the publishers were. And publishers are companies that take people's stories and turn them into books. So I'd send off my stories and I'd be so excited waiting for those letters to come back to tell me I was going to have a book. Well, I did get lots of letters. I stopped counting after 250. The thing is, these were called rejection letters, and these letters said, "Dear Kirby, we do not like your story, and we are not going to make it into a book." And I was like, why are these publishers not cooperating? This is so disappointing. I finally figured out what I want to do with my life. But there was something I needed to learn, and that there are two very important things for a writer, and I hadn't learned them yet. And actually, how I learned them is sort of an interesting way. I learned them when, about 10 years ago, Kirby, who had never had a dog in her life, decided to bring a little dog into her life, a dog whose name is Winston B. Larson. And Winston even loves to dress up for Halloween. He's such a good sport. But since I had never had a dog, I knew I needed to take a training class with Winston. And so he and I go off to the training class. And the first command that they taught us was sit, or taught me to teach Winston. Then the second command was to stay. And I was sitting there working with Winston on these commands, and all of a sudden I realized the two most important lessons for a writer, too, are to sit in her office chair every single day and stay there until she has polished her stories until they are the very best they can be. And once I figured that out, that writing was a job and I needed to take it very seriously, and I needed to send out not my first drafts like I'd been doing, but my polished drafts, sometimes my 10th draft. After I figured that out, I began to get some books published. That was pretty exciting. I have not always been a student of history, but when I became so fascinated with history, there's Winston and I working away in my office. When I became fascinated with history, I was especially intrigued by World War II. It seemed to have a tremendous impact on our country. And my husband gave me this book called Code Talker, and it was the memoir of a man who actually had been a code talker in World War II. Because I'd done a lot of reading about this war, I had heard of code talkers before, but there was so much I learned from Chester Nez's story. For instance, I had never realized that many young Navajo children, like 6, 7, 8 years old, were taken away from their families in the 1920s and 30s and beyond, and they were sent away to residential boarding schools. When they got to these schools, for example, the boys who in their culture were supposed to wear their hair long, they were forced to have their hair cut short, and they were forced to dress in clothing that was unfamiliar to them. In addition, when they got to these schools, if they were ever overheard speaking their own language, which was Navajo, they would get their mouths washed out with this disgusting soap called Fells Naphtha. And I once said a naughty word, and my mom washed my mouth out with Fells Naphtha soap, and I can tell you it's disgusting and terrible. So they were punished for speaking their own language. And I learned something else about their history. In the 1800s, they were forced to move from their homeland, which is in the Four Corners territory of our country, even moms with babies on their backs, and they had to walk miles and miles and miles to a new location called Bosque Redondo. And on this terrible walk, which the Navajo actually called the Long Walk, over 300 people perished in this terrible walk. And then on top of that, when they were finally allowed back to a smaller part of their homeland, now a reservation, they began to raise sheep to try to support themselves, sheep and goat. And when you think of the Navajos, you may think of the beautiful blankets and rugs that they weave, and that's from the wool from their goats and sheep. Well, after a few years of having a lot of sheep, the government decided that they had too many sheep, and so they were forced to give up some of their sheep, and thus some of the way they could support themselves and make money and feed their families. So I'm telling you all this to help you understand that the Navajo young men had been through many tough experiences. And so it was a shock to me to learn that after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, along with thousands of other young men, thousands of Navajo young men also enlisted in the Marines and in the Army. And it was hard for me to understand how they could be that self-sacrificing to do that for a country that really hadn't cared for them or supported them. But they did enlist. And there was a sergeant, not a Navajo, his name was Philip Johnston, and he had grown up on the Navajo reservation, and even though he'd lived there his whole life, he could only speak a few words of Navajo because it's such a difficult language to speak and to learn. And he got an idea that maybe the military could create a code based on the Navajo language because very few people could speak it. And he went to the military and he gave his proposal, and they accepted it. And 30 Navajo Marines volunteered to help create that first code. The initial code contained about 200 words, but over the course of the war, it evolved, and there ended up being about 400 words in the code. And the code talkers, that they came to be called, would be out in the battlefields with these very heavy radios, and they could quickly transmit and decipher codes even under just extreme battle situations. To give you one small example of how the code was used, the code talkers would think about things that they knew from nature. For example, they could think of a whale, which is a gigantic creature, and they compared it to a battleship, which is a gigantic ship. And I am not going to be able to pronounce this word correctly, but they called a battleship in Navajo, they called it Lotso, which is the same word for a whale. So that's one way that they use their language to develop a code. And if you're curious about all the words that they ended up developing in their Navajo Code Talkers dictionary, you can go to the website that's here on the screen, which is actually included in the resource materials that you received prior to the webinar today. But it's you'll be amazed when you look at it, how complicated the code is, and to have to memorize all that and be able to translate it on the spur of the moment. It's really an astonishing accomplishment. So if you can see me, you could tell that I am not Navajo. So I needed to enlist the help of some people who were Navajo to help me tell the story accurately and respectfully. And so now on your screen, you should see a picture of Dr. Roy O. Hawthorne, who was one of the 400 Navajo Code Talkers. And I reached out to Dr. Hawthorne through the Code Talkers Facebook page. I explained what I was trying to do. I asked if it felt like it was an okay thing for me to take on. And Dr. Hawthorne responded, and he said he was really excited that I was thinking of trying to tell this story for the middle grade audience. And he was terrific in telling me his own stories and things that he had experienced. And his stories really helped me to create the Navajo character, the Marine, in my book, Code Word Courage, who I named Denny Begay. And I used Begay because it's a common Navajo last name. And this is just an inside story between us. I used Denny because that is my baby brother's name, and I wanted to work him into a story. Another person who was tremendously helpful was the man who's standing in this photograph. His name is Michael Smith. He is the son of the man who's seated there, Samuel Jesse Smith Sr. And Jesse Smith Sr. was a Navajo Code Talker who actually served in the Battle of Iwo Jima, which is one of the battles that's referenced in Code Word Courage. Sadly, the elder Mr. Smith has passed away, but his son was also excited about this project, and so he graciously agreed to read my entire manuscript, and that's a big commitment. And he read through the whole thing to make sure I was being accurate and respectful of the Navajo culture. And he was a tremendous help in keeping me on the right track, but he was also a tremendous encourager, and I'm so grateful for the help of Dr. Hawthorne and Michael Smith. So after I got their encouragement and permission, of course I had to do my research. And so I began to read every book I could get my hand on about the Code Talkers, books that they had written themselves, books that were written about them by other people. These are actually two of the memoirs I read. And the book in the upper corner was written by the daughter of a Code Talker. And then I wanted to hear them if I could. And so thankfully, they had recorded some video interviews on this website, NavajoCodeTalkers.codes, and as well, there are some oral histories recorded at the Library of Congress, and those sites too are given to you as links in the documents that you received prior to the webinar. But I would highly recommend going to one of these sites and just listening to at least one of the men talk about their experiences. You know, when the war was over in 1945, the Code Talkers were told to go home and not tell anybody what they had done. And they did not. They went home and they didn't say a word to anyone, not their family members, not anyone. And so it wasn't until the late 1960s, when someone was doing some research on another topic, that they encountered some information about the Code Talkers in some then declassified documents. But it took 50 years in all for the Code Talkers to be recognized for their contributions to our country. And in 2001, President Bush presented gold medals to the 4 surviving Code Talkers. And if you get a chance to look at any images from that ceremony, it's really moving. And I encourage you to take a look at that. I love this quote because it really sums up what I believe. If we don't understand our past, we're going to have a hard time figuring out our present and a future. And I really do believe it's by understanding our past that we are given the ability to make changes in the present and changes in the future. And I particularly love writing stories about the past for young readers because I think they are really the hope for the future. And I think if they can understand, they will certainly figure things out for us. Because I write for young readers, kids your age, I like to have an 11-year-old character. And one advice almost every writer hears and gives is to write what you know. And I began to think about myself as an 11-year-old girl. And so I created a character named Billy Packer. I'm the one on the right in the striped sweater. I never quite fit in. I was always a little lonely, had a hard time making friends, a little bit goofy and left out. And so I knew what those feelings could feel like. And I thought that Billy Packer might be one of those kids similar to what I was like. And I was thinking if she was 11 in 1942, that would have made her a young girl living through the Great Depression. And I started to think about all the things that happened during the Great Depression. One of the most powerful things is that so many men and women left their families behind in search of work. And I was pretty sure that that was something that would have happened to Billy too. In fact, they were left on their great aunt's farm, her brother Leo and Billy, wondering and longing for their father to return, but he never came back. And I could just imagine how Billy would just listen to every car going down the highway and wonder, would my dad be in this car coming home finally? So you'll have to read to see if she ever does get reunited with him. Another thing I knew about Billy is that she would be like most other kids living in the United States, and that they would be participating in the war effort somehow. They might be planting a victory garden. Even boys would knit socks and mufflers for the soldiers. They might write them letters. They would definitely help purchase groceries using the coupon books that their families were given to ration out the food. And I would highly encourage you to check out the World War II Museum's website and get involved in their Get in the Scrap program, because it will really put you in the shoes of those children who were living during the war, and it will give you a great picture of the things that they did to pitch in and help out. Another thing kids like Billy would have done would be to save their nickels and dimes and quarters and bring them to school to purchase war stamps. And when they had purchased a book full of war stamps, they could trade that book in for a $25 savings bond. War bond, actually, they were called. And the reason they were called war bonds is that our government used the money that was raised through these efforts to help pay for the war. You've probably already figured out that wars can be incredibly expensive. I do a lot of different things to try to understand what it was like to live during World War II. I was not born then. I was born a ways after the war. And some of the things I like to do is like to read the books and comic books that kids would have read then. I like to listen to radio shows that they would have listened to, and that's actually easy to do on many different archives. Or listen to records that they would have listened to. I mean, remember, kids didn't have TV. Their entertainment was they either made their own entertainment or they listened to records or the radio. I even like to find old cookbooks and recreate recipes that kids might have eaten during World War II. I found some delicious, especially dessert recipes in cookbooks like this one, but there were some kind of icky recipes too, like this braised pork liver. And I have to be honest, I never really tried these recipes that don't sound as appealing. And then, of course, when I had completed all my research and I felt I had a good understanding of my characters, there's something else that's really important in these books that I've written about World War II. There is always a dog. And in Code Word Courage, the dog is actually a stray dog who's named Bear. And I modeled him after a Belgian sheepdog because the sheep were so important to the Navajo people. I didn't end up using that plot line in the book, but Bear stayed a big, smart shepherd. And in this story, Denny is the one who finds him when he's lost. And because he has to go off to fight in the war, he leaves him with Billy. And through this story, Code Word Courage, you will discover that Bear ends up saving both of his human friends. And I hope you'll take time to read it to find out how. It has really been fun for me to share a bit of the story and the work I was involved in to get this story in front of you. But now I'm going to turn the story back over to Kate.
All right. Thank you, Kirby, so much. And I am going to elaborate. Oh, can you hear me?
Oh, you double check.
Yeah. I'm going to elaborate on what Kirby talked about using 3 different parts from the story. So I'm going to go ahead and mute Kirby, and then we'll bring Kirby back on after we read 3 parts from we won't give it away, but we'll read 3 parts from the book, and then we'll do some Q&A.
Kate, I think you muted yourself and not me.
All right.
There we go.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys. And we are going to start on chapter 2, page 13. And so our first theme that we have to talk about before we talk about the code talkers themselves are the American Indian or Native American residential schools. So on page 13, it starts with, his buddy had no idea what it was like to grow up on the reservation. Being hauled off to boarding school as an 8-year-old, where the main lesson was being Diné, was unacceptable. 10 years later, Denny could still taste the soap that Kirby talked about. The principal would shove in his mouth every time he spoke Navajo, his own language. And so in World War II, as we now know, they used Navajo language to make a code, but this same code was a code that the American government, starting in about the 1870s, tried to get rid of. And so Native American, including Navajo children, but many other tribes as well, children were removed from their homes and from their families and brought to these boarding schools. Here we have a picture of one of these boarding schools. And they were meant to assimilate American Indian children into the greater American culture. It would take away, their way of life, their traditions, their way of dressing, but especially their language. They were usually given different names, a more American sounding name, and we're going to look at some pictures of what happened to what they looked like. But even more than that, they were not allowed to speak their language anymore. And so these languages, like Navajo, start to die out because people aren't speaking them anymore. So here we have a couple of pictures. Most of these school locations were in the west, in the northwest, near reservations themselves. There are some schools still left that you can go visit as museums. And then at the bottom, you see a Native American schoolboy from what he looked like when he came from the reservation into what he looked like just a couple months after after being at the reservation themselves. So here's another example. These are not Navajo children. These are Apache children. And they went to the Carlisle boarding school. And as you can see, they have long hair. They're wearing pretty much their traditional dress at the time. And then only about a couple months after they had been at this Carlisle boarding school, this is the same exact group of children. And you can see they are wearing totally different clothes. They have all of their haircut, and it basically looks like they have been assimilated into the broader culture around them. And so their Navajo language or their Apache culture or whatever tribe they came from, it starts to die out. And it doesn't really come back into use until World War II. This is going to cause some controversy that we'll talk about here in a little bit, but we're going to move on to our next theme, which is the code talkers themselves. So if you'll head to chapter 10, page 78, we're going to read about the code talkers themselves. Sergeant Johnson picked up a pointer and tapped at the list of words on the blackboard. Begay, what's this? The pointer landed on gah-gi. Crow, Denny answered. That's what it meant yesterday. Today, it means patrol plane. The pointer kept tapping. Taz chise. Swallow was a torpedo plane. Atsa, eagle, a transport plane. As the sergeant went down the list, Denny's heart beat faster. It was a code. The Navajo language was the basis of a code. That's why he was here. He glanced around the room. That's why they were all here. And so just like Kirby said in her presentation, Phil Johnson, who his parents were missionaries and he grew up on a Navajo reservation, had the idea to do this. He served actually in World War I, and he witnessed other Native American languages, specifically the Choctaw, being used in Europe. And so we get asked a lot, well, why then wasn't Choctaw used in World War II? And between World War I and World War II, German anthropologists actually went and studied most of the American Indian tribes in the United States and learned their language. But they never learned Navajo because it wasn't written down. Most of the other ones were written down. And Sergeant Phil Johnston knew this. So just like Kirby said, he brought his idea to the Marines and he had them do a test, and 30 Navajos ended up being the original Navajo Code Talkers. So here's a couple of pictures. In February of 1942, just 3 months after Pearl Harbor attacked the US and America is plunged into World War II, they did their first demonstration. And get this, the Navajos encoded, transmitted, and decoded a 3-line English message in 20 seconds, whereas machines from the time took 30 minutes to do that same job. And so all it took was this one test in front of these Marine Corps generals for the Marines to sign on to this program and make it a top secret mission. So the first code talkers immediately went to creating a military alphabet, because like we said, it wasn't written down as Navajos did. And so they had to basically write it down and create it on their own. And Kirby showed us some great examples of words that they used for substituting. And so not only are they the code talkers, but they created the code themselves, which is really cool. And so here at the museum, we actually have an oral history from Thomas Begay, one of the code talkers who fought in World War II. And we're going to listen to what he says about being a code talker.
I did not enlist in the Marine Corps for a code talker. I signed up to be aerial gunner. Later, I was told that I was going to learn Navajo Code to provide and maintain communication for all the Marines. We transmit over the radio in Navajo. We did everything by memory, like the Medicine Man or prayers, Navajo songs. So it wasn't too hard for me to memorize all this stuff. I was on command ship, and we went through Guam, Saipan. Then they told us that we were going to hit Iwo Jima. That should be an easy island because the Army Air Force has been bombing, Navy's been shelling. There should be no Japanese left on that island. And one morning, about 2 in the morning, we were all awakened by loudspeaker. Wake up and get ready. Get your last breakfast, steak and eggs. So I guess we were in for surprise. We had the radio going already, and then about 0900, the first group of Marines hit the beach. Well, I tell you, I was numb when I hit the sand. Had no feeling at all, but I had to stay low because the Japanese knew who to hit, especially radio men or officers. They tried to knock out the radio the first shot. And those Japanese, they're pretty good shooters. They don't mess around. They're there to kill. Like I said, I signed up for aerial gunner, and I ended up in the wrong place.
And so a little background on Thomas, because here we have him in a picture, obviously a little bit after World War II, but he was born in New Mexico, and he grew up only speaking Navajo. And then at age 13, he attended one of those boarding schools we talked about and learned English for the first time. And so at 16, right after Pearl Harbor, he ends up enlisting in the Marine Corps and goes on to fight in World War II. And he's going to be one of those Marines that was recognized from President Bush just a couple years ago. And so we'll talk more about the Code Talkers when we get to questions and answers, but I also want to talk a little bit about the home front, because if you've read the book, or if you plan on reading it, the home front is a big part of the story. And so we're going to start on page 159 with chapter 20. Billy pasted under the gold star on the frilly red heart she just cut out. Would a homemade Valentine really cheer up an injured soldier? I wish we could go with Miss Daly and help hand out the cards, Kit said. Hazel agreed. Mom's Red Cross ladies go every week to Camp Pendleton to deliver mail at the hospital. She says the soldiers are so glad to get it. Too bad we aren't 14, Clarice chimed in. Then we could go too. Billy was relieved about the hospital's rules against visitors under 14. It wasn't that she was squeamish about seeing the injuries, much, but she knew if she stepped one foot into that place, she would be reminded that Leo or Denny could easily be one of those recovering from war wounds. And so this chapter and this segment talks about a couple of different home front themes. And so the first one is just that almost every American in World War II was touched by World War II. So even though Billy is just a young girl, she's not in the military, she's just at school. She knew her brother and her brother's friend fighting in it. And so almost everyone at this time either had a family member or someone that they knew or loved who was fighting in the military, which brings us to something that Kirby also talked about, and I actually have one here with me. Every American was issued a ration book with stamps in them every month. Even students like you got one. And as different food became scarce, they were added to those rationing lists. And so the books would change. And you had to learn about them at school. And so many classrooms had posters and ration books that the teacher used to teach how to ration food. You had to use math, along with a little bit of just intuition on how to, go to the grocery store and use not just money, but rations. And like I said, so if you ever come to the museum, we have a bunch of these here. Or if you do get in the scrap, like Kirby talked about, we also have ration books in there. But I'm going to take it to the present day right now. And so back in World War II on the home front, and right now, just as you saw, Billy and other students wrote letters to people who were fighting overseas. And you as a student can actually still do that in 2018. And Operation Gratitude, which you see on your screen here, has delivered over 2.1 million care packages with things like letters, candy, blankets, all kinds of things to Americans serving overseas and actually here at home too. If you look at the bottom, one of their biggest volunteers is actually Steve, who is a 100-year-old World War II veteran, and he talks about he got letters when he was in World War II, and so he wanted to do that same thing to people who are fighting in 2018. And so we'll send out some information just in case your class is ever interested in getting, on board with Operation Gratitude. But those are our 3 big themes that we're going to talk about today with the passages. But there are so many more World War II themes within this book, but I don't want to give it all away because you're going to have to read it if you haven't. And so now we are going to move. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to unmute Kirby, and we are going to move to our Q&A session. So if you have any questions, we've gotten a couple already, but go ahead and start writing them in the Q&A, and we'll go from there. And so I'm going to start with my first question, Kirby, which is from Justice in North Carolina. And he wants to know, why did you call it code word courage? What does courage mean to you?
Oh, that is such a great question. Well, first of all, Justice, I have to tell you that originally I titled the book Bear after the dog in the book. And my editor thought we needed a stronger title. And so we made lists of what the title could possibly be. And I felt strongly that code needed to be in the title. And so we played around with code word, those different things. And I have a dog myself. You saw the picture, Winston, and I walk him every day. And it's while I'm on my walks that I get my best thinking done. And we were walking, and I was thinking about how one of the reasons I was motivated to write this story is that I was so impressed by the courage, the selfless courage of the Navajo Code Talkers. And so it just kind of like clicked like that. And I like code word courage. And so I rushed home and emailed my editor, and she really liked it too. And so I think I was trying to capture in just like very succinctly what I was celebrating and trying to honor in those amazing men and what they had done.
That's awesome. I think it's a great title. And if I had to answer, what does courage mean today, Justice? I think that I would say that it's, everyday common people stepping up to doing uncommon, things that they don't necessarily think they did anything special because they were just doing their duty and what, they were supposed to do. That was a really great question. So I'm actually going to move on to another question, and we'll stick with the dog theme. And why do you like to put dogs in this story, and really all your other World War II stories as well?
Well, it actually was sort of one of those happy accidents. The very first book that I wrote in this series is called Dash. It's not the first one that was published, but it was the first one I wrote. And it was about a Japanese American girl who was separated from her dog when the girl was sent to one of the incarceration camps during World War II. And I found that just having that dog in there gave me a way to talk about heavier issues and more emotions. And so it worked so well that when my editor asked if I had another idea, I said yes before I even had the idea. And then I went researching, like, where else were dogs involved at the home front? And I learned about the Dogs for Defense program, which was the inspiration for the book Duke. But, dogs are just they love us. They're so loyal and faithful. And I think they have a good way of bringing us into a story. For example, I said earlier, I didn't really like history when I was a kid, but I think if I'd had a book with a dog in it that was historical, I would have just gobbled that book up. So I think dogs are a great way to draw us into the story, and then hopefully I do a good job of telling about the historical events, so you want to stick with the story.
Awesome. Exactly. And I'm actually going to move out of the way for a second, because if you can see behind me, the map in my office is actually my favorite map of all time. It is war dogs that were used in the Pacific theater. So if you can see, there are all these little dots. We're looking at the Pacific. The green dots are Marine Corps units that had actual working dogs. So here we know that, policemen, military, firefighters, they all use dogs. But World War II was the official first use of dogs. And so the red, that's where the Army used the working dogs. So famous battles like Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, Okinawa, they all had working dogs that did so well that they continued to use dogs in every aspect of the military from then on. And so any book that I can read about World War II and dogs, sign me up. So now we're going to move a little bit more towards your research and your history. And Gabriel wants to know, why were they not allowed to speak their language at those schools?
Well, Kate, I think you did a great job of explaining that. So the concept was that they wanted the Navajo, actually any Native American, but since I wrote about the Navajos, to be more part of the American culture. And you have to realize people looked at things differently in times past, and we're kind of feeling like, well, when other immigrants come to this country, maybe like the Irish or Italians, they learn to speak English. So anyone living here should learn to speak English. And there was also, I think, a feeling that if they took the language away from them, that would also help them be more part of the then current American culture. So yeah, that was really basically it. They just wanted them to be more American, which is quite ironic when you think about it, because they were here before the Europeans. So
exactly. There's a story that comes from World War II where they had to keep this top secret so much that the commanders didn't even know that these units existed. And once they saw it in action once, then all the commanders throughout the Pacific wanted these code talkers, but they weren't quite sure what language they were speaking or who they were, because they had gone to these schools and their culture had almost died out. But it is ironic because World War II actually then helped save that culture, which brings us to our next question from Marco, and I can always help answer this too, but why did the military want to keep code talkers and have their secrets after World War II? Why couldn't they just talk about it?
Yeah, well, I'm not a military expert, but my guess would be that though they hoped that would be the war to end all wars, there was always a possibility there would be future wars. And I'm guessing because that code had been so successful, the Japanese military was never able to decipher that code. So I'm guessing that they wanted to keep that in their back pocket like a secret weapon. And so, they didn't want the code talkers to talk about it because they didn't want anybody to know in case they needed to use it again. So that would be my best guess. Kate, maybe you have more information than I do about that.
Yep, no, you are exactly right. So, World War II ends in 1945, and we're plunged right into the Cold War, and we're not quite sure exactly what that's going to look like or what we're going to have to do. We've soon to go fight a war in Korea, and the code talkers are used there as well. And so basically, they were afraid that if they declassified it and allowed people to talk about it, then whoever our enemy may be in the future might be able to decipher that code. Which brings us to, were there any other Native Americans in World War II other than the Navajo Code Talkers? We have a question from California about that one.
Right, and I don't have my book right in front of me, but if you read the author's note in the back, I believe, if I'm remembering quickly, there were 40 other Native American tribes that were represented in the military services, and not all of them were necessarily working in a code talking manner, but the list is in the back of the book, and so you can get it completely from there. But absolutely, there were men, well, mostly men. I don't believe there were any women from other tribes who were involved in the war efforts.
Yep, and I've actually got 2 facts about that,
Oh, good.
or really 3. So the tribes often are considered within America their own nations, and almost every nation declared war on the Axis right after America and the Allies declared war on the Axis powers. So they were at war themselves, and 99% of eligible Native American young men had signed up to join the war effort only a couple months after World War II started. That's the highest percentage of any ethnic group out there by far. And I only learned this yesterday when I was researching other Native American tribes, but the first code ever transmitted and decoded on D-Day was from a Native, it was not Navajo, but it was a Native American code talker, actually a Choctaw Indian. And so I thought that was really cool that code talkers, although they're famous in the Pacific, they were used in other places too. So I learned a couple of those things yesterday.
Can you see why I love history now? I mean, you just keep learning these things and how they tie together. It's so great.
So speaking of history in World War II and dogs, do you have any other books planned about dogs in war that you're allowed to talk about?
Thank you for asking it that way. Yeah, I do not like to talk about books I'm working on very much at all, but I have written 6 books set in World War II. And after I finished Code Word Courage, I felt like I wanted to explore a different time period. So I've actually moved away from the war and going a little farther back in time. And this is all I'm going to say, but I'm working on a new book set in 1929. So I just needed a little break from World War II to kind of look at a few things differently. And so far, there's not a dog in this book, but I'm not finished, so one never knows how that's going to turn out.
And that's a great segment into the next couple of questions we're going to ask, and we're going to move away from the historical part and into more of the English language arts part. And so the first question I'm going to ask is, why did you choose to tell this story from 2 different perspectives?
That is a really great question. I wrestled with that myself, how to do that. And well, actually, there's 3 perspectives because Bear also tells a little bit.
True.
But I felt like I would be able to tell the story more fully if I used 2 points of view. For example, so much of what Denny was doing as a code talker Billy would not be able to see that. And I suppose I could have had him write her a letter, but yet he wouldn't have been allowed to tell her what he was doing in a letter. So as I wrestled with different possibilities, it seemed to me that the best way to fully tell that story was to use 2 points of view. And I did that in Liberty as well. So sometimes the story just seems to need the fullness of the experiences of 2 main characters to honor the story fully. So
awesome. Well, I this is true. Bear, we forgot about Bear. So it really is 3 perspectives. Students in South Carolina want to know, so what are some tips then to be a successful writer?
So the first tip, I mean, it might seem obvious, but it's to read as much as you can. And I visit a lot of schools. In fact, I'm not at my home right now. I'm in Savannah. I've been visiting schools here. And when I go to school, I notice that a lot of kids will get hooked on one genre of book. For example, let's say fantasy. And I would say if you want to be a writer, yes, read your fantasy, but try to read in a variety of different genres. And that will help that whole sense of story kind of get into your bones and into your heart. And this other tip, I know it's going to sound kind of funny, but it's really just to pay attention. For example, I would never have written the book Liberty had I not visited the World War II Museum on a really hot day. I needed to be someplace cool when I was in New Orleans, and they had air conditioning. So I went inside and, of course, got lost in there because it's so wonderful. But it was there that I learned about Andrew Jackson Higgins and his boats. And so I paid attention to what I was learning there. And I was so curious, I had to learn more. So that led to my writing another book. So I just encourage you to pay attention wherever you are and to read as much as you can. And I think those are two good tips that will get you a long ways to being a good writer.
The students in Bluffton, South Carolina say, come visit us.
I want to come to Bluffton. I think you're just like over the bridge or something, right?
So we'll do one more English language arts question. And Heather wants to know, as a writer, why do you send rough drafts first and not just a totally polished draft right away?
Okay, so that's a really great question. And actually, the truth of it is I work with an editor at Scholastic, but she doesn't even get to see my rough drafts because I have to tell you, my rough drafts are so rough and terrible. I also co-write nonfiction picture books with a good friend named Mary Nethery, and Mary is the trusted first reader of all of my rough drafts because my little heart is so fragile at that stage, and I don't, I want someone that I know really cares about me. And so Mary reads my rough drafts, and she usually, gives me lots of positive, but she usually says something like, I really like this story, but you should probably have a plot. And so then I go back and look at ways to have a plot. And so I work on that. And then when I send it to my editor, so she may be getting like the third draft or the fourth draft, I'm trying to send her something that's pretty solid that she'll be able to say, okay, yeah, I can see this. Maybe you this part or finish out that part. But she's a very busy person. She has lots of books to shepherd. And so I want to make sure that I give her something that she can, have time for and deal with. So, but not even my beloved editor gets to see my first draft because they are really horrible. So there's hope for anyone else out there who writes terrible first drafts.
That's awesome. Where do you do most of your writing?
So I'm lucky. I have a little office in my house, and that's where I do most of my writing. Now, a lot of my research takes me away to other places. So I'll do like note-taking other places. But when I get ready to revise that terrible first draft, I like to go to like a really noisy coffee shop and read through the manuscript. And if I get distracted by the noise of the coffee maker or someone talking nearby, I know that that's a place in the manuscript that I need to work on because I've lost interest or, been distracted. So I love to be in a noisy place when I'm reading through for revision.
Oh, awesome. I like to be, when I'm working, have a little bit of background noise as well. So we've only got time for a couple more questions before our time is up with Kirby. And so Alec wants to know, what was the first book you ever tried to write?
The first book I ever tried to write, which did not get published, was a picture book inspired by my little sister, my baby sister, who my mom had these great red high heels, and my little sister would put on these red high heels, and when she put them on and went clomping around the house, we couldn't call her by her name, which was Lisa. We had to call her Mrs. Burns for some reason, and that just tickled me. And so I tried so hard to write a picture book about a little girl who turns into someone else when she puts on her mom's shoes. But that, I could never get that to work. So that was the very first book I tried to send out.
Awesome. And so we actually had a question emailed to us a couple of days ago. I want to make sure. So the third graders at Willow Hill Christian School want to ask, are there any Navajo Code Talkers that are still alive that we know about?
There are. I don't have all of their names. They're very few in number because realize we're talking now in 2018, and even if they were 16 years old, like Mr. Begay was when he enlisted, that would make them very old by this point. So there are a few left. There are none of the original 30 Code Talkers still living. Chester Nez was the last one of those to, it was the last to survive, and he passed away several years ago. So.
And so here at the National World War II Museum, that is something that we focus on, and it is collecting oral histories from veterans so that, when the time passes and there are no more World War II veterans out there, we still have those stories. And that's how we have our Code Talker that we just had a little portion we listened to. We collected his oral history a couple of years ago. And so, like Kirby said, of the original group that created the code, there are none left, but there were over 420 that actually are considered code talkers, and so there are still a few that are left, and they've actually gone back and visited the sites a couple times. But Isaac wants to know, going back to English language arts, how long does it take to get a story published?
Oh, well, if you're talking from the time I finished the manuscript to sending it to my editor, it will take about 1 year, because the manuscript has to be copy edited and the facts all have to be checked, and then it has to be, put in the form of a book, and then it has to get a cover. So that, from the time I turn in an accepted manuscript to the time I hold a book in my hand, is about 1 year. So you have to be kind of patient when you're an author.
Definitely, yeah. And so this is going to be our last question of the day, and then we'll kind of wrap up. We're coming back to Bluffton, South Carolina.
Okay.
So, Kirby, how do you decide what kind of personalities that your characters should have? Is there any kind of strategy that you do?
That is such a great question. And it actually has to do with what I think the main problem, or sometimes people call it the dramatic question of a story is. Because then, so if it's about, trying to find a friend, I might make that character be a little prickly or hard to get to know, so that you create a little friction between the problem you're trying to solve and the character who's trying to solve it. So I do think about things like that. I also borrow personality traits from the people I know and love. So occasionally I think they recognize themselves in the book, but mainly I'm trying to think of if this is what I'm trying to talk about in the story, what kind of character would really struggle most with that? So that is a big question I ask myself. And sometimes I don't even know until I've completed the first draft how to really answer all that for myself.
That's yeah. I feel like it would be difficult. I remember writing books when I was in elementary school, and it's definitely a process. And the only way you're going to get better at it is to keep trying and to keep writing. And so we are going to wrap up here. I'm going to share out the museum's discount code one more time. If you haven't read the book, you go to our website, which is in the teacher guide, or if you just go to our website and type in code word courage, it will pop up. And if you use the code webinar, you will have a 20% discount. And so speaking of webinars, we actually have another one coming up on January 25th for the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, where I will be interviewing a Holocaust survivor. But I'm going to leave the last word to Kirby, and I really appreciate you guys listening to us and learning about the Code Talkers with us at the National World War II Museum.
And Kate, I'm so grateful for this opportunity, because I really do love to talk about writing and about books. And I was incredibly impressed with the questions that we got today. And it really shows me that we do have good writers and readers out there who are participating in this webinar. So thank you for all your hard work too, Kate, and the people who are participating. And I wish I could get to Bluffton.
All right, so don't stop reading and writing out there, and I hope you tune in for our next webinar here at the National World War II Museum. Have a great Thursday, guys.
Bye.
End it.